Valentine. An alien sci-fi romance. A Tale in the Colony series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. You really should consider putting in a request for a replacement heart. I could file it for you, marked as urgent, but you'd have to transfer to the Genesis for the procedure. Our medbay here on the Magellan malfunctions so often, it's only a matter of time before it pronounces someone dead while their heart's still beating. Valentine forced himself to smile at Maya, despite the dread squeezing his heart. She held his fate and his secret in her hands. He could only hope she wasn't the sort to betray or blackmail him over it. Not unless his life depended on it. If she was as good a medic as her misguided thoroughness indicated, she would have no qualms about revealing his secret to save his life. He had to hope it never came to that. This heart belongs to my wife, Anna. I'm not sure if she'd forgive me if I replaced it, even with a better model. Besides, it's kept beating this long, I'm sure it can wait until after the war is over. We're short on techs as it is, the Magellan needs me. As if the Magellan had heard him, the alarm blared into life, summoning all available crew to battle stations. If I don't get down to engineering, the ship will probably fall apart. You get into one of the port side life pods. Remember, I haven't had a chance to fix the starboard ones yet. Can't have the ship's only medic hurt by a malfunction. He saluted her and set off down the corridor. Maya called after him, I remember. You get your ass down to engineering and keep us all safe. Valentine sighed. That's what this whole war was about, keeping everyone safe from the aliens out there that had invaded the Auton system. He'd never expected it would also mean keeping everyone safe from space itself, in a ship that threatened to break down at least a dozen times a day. If he had his way, the Magellan would have been turned into scrap metal a long time ago. Just as long as they were all safely disembarked when it happened. There you are. Thank the stars, I thought I'd have to keep this ship running by myself. Barrys exclaimed as Valentine jogged into engineering. As if I could sleep soundly in my bunk, knowing you have sole responsibility for the whole ship's safety, Valentine joked. Barrys glanced up at the ceiling before saying in a hushed whisper, if it were left up to the ship, she would kill us all in our sleep. I pray the war ends soon before she gets that chance. For what was likely the 100th time that day, Barrys's hands curled into horns to ward off any bad luck the evil eyes of the Magellan might wish upon him. Valentine wasn't as superstitious as Barrys, but he had to admit, sometimes he wondered if luck was all that held the Magellan together. Good luck, not bad. Because good luck had saved his wife Anna when the Titan terrorists attacked her lab on Elysium, and good luck would keep them both safe until he returned home to her. He had to believe it. Or what was he fighting for? The comm on the wall buzzed. Bridge to engineering, come in? The words were barely audible through the static. The comm system needed repairs as much as anything else on this ship, but they wouldn't get time today. Barrys was closer. This is engineering. Valentine prayed that they needed a repairman to fix something on the bridge. A sparking console perhaps. Of course, he wasn't that lucky. Bring the reactor up to full capacity. I want all available power diverted to the engines, immediately. Barrys's mouth dropped open. To be fair, so did Valentine's. Running the reactor at more than half capacity risked blowing up the ship, and anything in that sector of space. Full capacity could kill them all. Valentine recovered his voice first. Bridge, you realize the reactor can't sustain that level of power output. The magnetic containment field can't hold it for long and stuff starts to melt. At best, we can give you 15, maybe 20 minutes at maximum power, before we have to vent at least half the plasma. There was a pause followed by, acknowledged, but the order stands. Give the engines as much juice as you can, and when you vent the plasma, try to send it in the same direction as the engines are pointing. 20 minutes will have to be enough. Bridge out. Barry stared at Valentine, his thoughts adding up the information at the same time. Whatever's out there, we're running from it. It must be bad if we're risking a reactor overload to do it. Valentine swallowed. Well, if we can't outrun it, a reactor overload's a better way to go than slowly suffocating in space. At least it's pretty much instantaneous. Barry's managed a sickly smile. If it's all the same to you, I'd rather not die today, or overload the reactor. Let's get this thing fueled up. The sooner we do, the sooner we can vent it. Agreed. Valentine increased the fuel flow steadily, never taking his eyes off the screen, while he knew Barry's watched the control console for warning lights with equal intensity. With a ship as old as the Magellan, it wasn't a matter of if a warning appeared, as when it would. Right, that's the fuel going in. Setting up the power diversion now, Valentine said, more to himself than anything else, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw Barry's nod. No warnings yet. All spare power diverted to the engines, with the exception of auxiliary battery reserves, Valentine said. The fuel was steadily trickling into the reactor, so he had a minute to satisfy his curiosity. Want to see whatever it is we're running from? Stars, yes, Barry said. Valentine pulled up the external sensors, scanning through the feeds, but all he saw were rocks. Floating in the black. We're in an asteroid field. Plenty of rocks, but there's no one out here but us. Barry's frowned. Sensors must have picked up something if we're risking the reactor to run from it. Not to mention venting precious fuel. Maybe it's stealthed so we can't see it, or hiding behind one of the rocks. Valentine saw a flash of light an instant before something slammed into the ship, sending them sprawling. Something's out there and it's shooting at us. Barry's cried, his eyes wide with fright. Run away, Valentine muttered to himself, his eyes darting from the reactor to the control board to his display. The vacuum chamber was full, magnetic containment was holding, and the temperature had begun to rise. Yep, the engines were definitely accelerating. In an old ship like the Magellan, you could feel the G-force, even through the artificial gravity. Not like the Genesis. Another impact shook the ship, sending Valentine to his knees. Whatever was firing on them, it was keeping up. At this rate, any extra power from the reactor would be too little, too late. A third shot cannoned into the ship. Valentine hung onto the bulkhead, barely managing to stay on his feet, but Barry's wasn't so lucky, slamming into the reactor wall. A new alarm began blaring. Valentine's eyes darted to the control board, but none of the reactor warning lights glowed red yet. Attention all crew. Abandon ship. Get to an escape pod and abandon ship. Attention all crew. It was a recorded message, but something in the emotionless tone chilled Valentine more than a human voice might have. Had their enemy taken out the bridge, and now they were drifting in space, with no one at the helm? They had to shut the engines down and the reactor. If they didn't, it wouldn't matter how many people made it into escape pods, the pods wouldn't survive the fusion bomb the ship would become. Barry's. Help me shut this down. When he didn't receive a response, Valentine yelled, Barry's? Barry slid down the side of the reactor and lay on the floor, unmoving. Stars, Valentine swore. He checked Barry's was breathing. He was, but his hands came away bloodied. A quick search revealed a head wound and burns from where Barry's back had been against the reactor wall too long. Valentine felt gravity slipping and activated the magnetic field on his boots, anchoring himself to the ground. Barry's floated up, like something out of an occult horror movie. Valentine grabbed Barry's and launched them both toward the nearest escape pod. He shoved his unconscious colleague inside, set the stasis field to activate as soon as the pod was clear of the ship, and closed the doors. See you in salvage, he said as the escape pod launched. A new alarm sounded, but Valentine recognized this screech. it was the temperature sensor on the reactor heat exchanger. Time to shut it down. Valentine reached for the controls. He considered only venting half the fuel as ordered, then thought better of it. If there was no one to monitor the ancient reactor, even at half power, it was likely to do something disastrous. Better to vent the whole vacuum chamber. The computer asked for extra verification codes. This was something you only did in emergencies after all, and Valentine entered them. On second thought, he should activate the extra coolant dump too, just in case. As his hands touched the controls, lightning arced across the board, seizing him in its relentless grip so he couldn't break free. An eternity passed, the current burning through his very bones before Valentine toppled over, away from the console. Everything ached, but the pain in his chest was the worst. If Maya were here, she'd have her emergency, he thought, as the throbbing ache moved down his arm and into his jaw. This must be what a heart attack felt like. Attention all crew. Abandon ship. Get to an escape pod and abandon ship. Valentine managed a stiff nod. Yes, he'd obey that order now. Because if he could make it into stasis, whoever revived him could deal with the heart attack and replace whatever parts of him they wanted. Maybe Maya. Valentine swam through the reactor room, headed for the nearest escape pod. He dived inside, kicking the door controls with his foot so they closed behind him. Stasis will engage in 5-4. Oh, but Anna wouldn't be happy. His heart belonged to Anna. 3.2. He'd get her a new one. She deserved a new one that beat only for her and never, ever threatened to give up. 1-0. As long as she was safe. He had to believe she was safe and that he'd see her again. Stasis engaged. The universe went black. Anna had scarcely set foot in the sclerophyll biome before she came face to face with Darth Vader. Only you could be so bold, she said, shaking her head. If the Senate only knew that you're the best dad in the galaxy, they'd hurry up and terraform Elysium, so you could head down there and show them your skills. Now out of my way, the new eggs are hatching and I need to be there. No amount of fluffing about by you is going to stop me. She pushed past the agitated emu and marched toward the shed. She had a video feed set up, ready to capture the first ever images of a Bowden's dwarf emu chick, which would also be the first of its kind seen in almost 1,000 years, since they'd been driven extinct by short-sighted colonists back on Earth. This colony would bring them back to life and hopefully give them a fighting chance to survive well into the future. Well, if they survived into adulthood here, like Darth and his brood. She palmed open the door, letting it hiss shut behind her before activating the inner door. Not quite an airlock, but it did help to keep the temperature constant inside when outside could vary a bit. And it kept the emus from mixing before they were supposed to. Only one incubator sat in the cavern-like space, where she could easily fit a dozen if she needed to. Not this time though, this one precious clutch of eggs occupied all her attention. If she could raise even one of these babies to adulthood, then she had a chance to bring back all the extinct emu species. Maybe even Moa. But first, these babies had to hatch. Anna sank down onto the floor beside the incubator. The first cracks had appeared about an hour ago when she was finishing up her lunch, but she'd known she had at least an hour or two before the first baby emerged, and a couple hours more before the chicks would be out of the eggs entirely. She'd promised Prometheus the footage, so he could do a time-lapse with a feature on the dwarf emus, if they survived. Even if they didn't, these tiny babies would be famous. Poor Darth would be so jealous if he knew. But wait, what was that movement? One egg was rocking, a piece of the shell lifting away just the littlest bit. Every second she watched felt like forever, and yet it was over quite quickly. The chick just kept butting its little head against that shell, pushing the pieces higher a little each time, until the egg toppled over on its side, cracking in half from the force of the fall. The chick, sensing victory, pushed again until the two halves split apart and the baby bird sprawled on the warm floor of the incubator. Anna peered at it, watching to see if it was still breathing. Thankfully it was. Carefully, she reached into the incubator to take out the bits of broken shell. She'd done it. The first Bowden's dwarf emu to be born into the Alton system, right here. She could be more proud than if she'd given birth herself. More, maybe, seeing as giving birth to a human baby only required a bit of sex, followed by 9 months of carrying it around in your belly, which any fertile human could accomplish, while bringing an extinct bird back to life for the first time, would have earned her all sorts of accolades from her colleagues back on Earth, Mars and the other planets of the solar system. A pity they'd never know. If only Valentine were here to see it. He'd understand. He'd been there on Titan when she'd first started this quest, and he'd seen so many failures along the way. That he hadn't lived long enough to see the first real success, it was that stupid war that had killed him. He joined the fight to protect her, he'd said, as an engineer and not a fighter, but the fighting had taken him anyway, when the Magellan, the ship he'd served on, had been blown up in a battle. That had been 4 years ago. 4 long, lonely years, wishing he'd never joined the war effort, watching the war end in a truce so anticlimactic, even she wasn't sure what they'd been fighting for. Had Valentine died for nothing? In the darkest hours of the night, it wasn't the why of Valentine's death that worried her, but the when and how. She hoped it had been quick and painless, but no one had been able to tell her. They'd called off the search for survivors after 3 months. Soon after that was when she'd finally lost hope that she'd ever seen him again. Her tablet chimed, and incoming message from the hospital. Strange she wasn't sick or injured. Perhaps they wanted her for a routine checkup? Ah, that must be it. She swiped to open the message, only to discover it was a live video call. Dr. Anna Gullis, the woman on the screen asked. Yes, that's me, Anna said. Dr. Gullis, it's about your husband. Anna almost dropped her tablet in surprise. I'll be right there. I'm here to see Valentine Gullis, please, Anna said breathlessly to the hospital receptionist. The woman blinked at her, then lowered her eyes to her tablet. Friend or relative? I'm his wife, Anna said. Stars, she'd almost said she was his widow. Well, until she'd received that message, she'd thought she was a widow. Now, she could barely believe it. The receptionist nodded. He's in region, on level 4. Take the blue elevator, then follow the signs to regeneration. Regeneration? She'd heard about it, of course, as a treatment offered by a few very exclusive clinics on Earth. Clinics that you could only use if your parents had chosen to preserve your stem cells at birth, for an exorbitant sum, of course, which was barely a pittance compared to the cost of taking those cells out of stasis to regenerate parts of your body that you'd lost or needed replacing. Definitely not something her family or Valentine's could afford, or either of them now they were adults. Besides, even if Valentine's family had preserved his stem cells, there's no way they would have been aboard the Genesis. So she'd go to Region, find out where Valentine really was, and go there next. But at the front desk in Region, the receptionist didn't even pause to look at her tablet. Ward 5, she said, pointing. Anna took a deep breath before stepping inside Ward 5. It didn't look like any hospital ward she'd ever seen before. More like an aquarium, with a row of cylindrical glass tanks that bubbled softly. The only light in the room came from the tablets clipped to each tank, each bearing a different name. Gulis, Valentine was on the end. Anna cupped her hands around her eyes and peered into Valentine's tank. She could faintly see a shadowy form that might be human, but there was no way of telling if it was Valentine. Somehow, she found herself back at Region reception. I'm not sure, this isn't what I expected. Are you sure Valentine Gullis is here? She asked. The receptionist looked her up and down. You're not a doctor then? Anna smiled faintly. Well, I am, but not a medical doctor. My PhD's in ornithology. I work in Eden Labs, raising birds for terraforming. I was with the emus when I got the call telling me Valentine he's my husband. When I heard, I came straight here. Sympathy dawned on the receptionist's face. Oh, I see. Whoever called you should have been more clear then. We've been notifying the families as patients' identities become known, but Valentine Gullis took some time to identify because his pod was damaged. We don't get many visitors for the patients in region. Not until they're released to the normal wards on level 3. But I'm here. And if he's really here, I thought he was dead. Are you sure it's him? How can you tell? Anna asked. The receptionist shrugged. Some of them had identification on their uniforms when they went into stasis. The rest have been identified by surviving members of the Magellan crew. Valentine, he needed more regeneration than the others because of the damage to the pod, before any kind of facial recognition was possible. Oh stars! Tears poured out of Anna's eyes too fast for her to stop. How badly was he hurt? The receptionist shook her head. I'm sorry, Mrs. Gullis, but we won't know for sure until he's well enough to leave the tank and wake up. We can regenerate most of the human body now, but even if brain cells grow back, we can't replace the memories that were lost. So while we can be sure your husband's healthy body is in that tank, the man who wakes up in it might not be the husband you knew. Is there anything I can do? Anna asked, even as she knew there was nothing. The receptionist shrugged. Talk to him if you like. Ward 5 is for final stage regeneration. Their vital stats have to be within normal ranges or an alarm sounds, so they have normal heartbeat, brain activity, everything. He can probably hear you inside the tank. Just like a coma patient, really. Talk to him. The patients here don't get many visitors, so it's up to you. If you want to go home and wait for someone to call you when he's released to a ward downstairs. Anna took a deep breath. No, I'll talk to him. I never thought I'd get the chance to talk to him again. So I will. She forced her feet to carry her back to Ward 5, and the tank where Valentine's ghostly form hung suspended in the water. She'd lost count of the number of times she'd wished she could talk to her husband one more time. Now she had her wish, and she didn't know what to say.